Hey, what's up, guys? I know like composition can be one of those topics that can be over talked about. I mean, look at any composition trick that you type in the YouTube search bar and you're going to come away with hundreds of videos, maybe even thousands, that talk about the exact same topics in composition that you can use to make your photographs a little bit better. That's honestly one of the reasons that I burned out on photography in the first place, is just the same thing over and over. There has to be more. There has to be a next step or a next level of compositions. And I recently filmed an entire course on compositions and how to take your compositions to the next level. And there are several different chapters within that course on using negative space, on shapes within landscape photography, on perspectives. Lots of different topics on how you can improve upon or maybe take your compositions to the next level while still harkening back to those basics of composition. So I wanted to do something that was a little bit different. When I finished the course, I decided to make it free. So it's completely free. It's linked below in the video description. It's in the comment section. It's pinned to the top. And what I wanted to do was share just the first chapter to that course in this video. Since it is free anyways, why not just put it up on YouTube? Here's the first chapter of that course on using shapes in your landscape photography composition. One thing that's so compelling about nature and the outdoors and landscape is that it actually produces repetition, patterns, and shapes for us to use if we're able to see those things properly to create really creative images. And I think seeing those shapes, especially multiple shapes in one composition, is a way that you can immediately level up the interest level of your photos. So when we're thinking about shapes, we're thinking not only about the core principle, that is a leading line, which is a shape in of itself, a line, but we're also thinking about what does that line do? Does it create certain ovals, circular patterns, curves? Does it lead you to squares, triangles? Can other shapes that we see be formed into these leading lines or even arrows within our images? And I think once you grasp this concept of shapes in nature is when you start to see those immediately and you start to mirror up some shapes together. I think for me, in the landscapes that I typically shoot, rectangles and squares are probably the hardest things to grasp in terms of shapes. I don't have too many images that hold a lot of rectangles and squares, although they do pop up once or twice in the landscape. I think a lot of photographers see opportunities, whether they know it or not, with triangles and with arrows. That's pairing lines and triangles together, and also circular shapes in the landscape. I think those are the ones that really take the landscape to the next level. And let's talk about triangles for a little while. Let's look at this photograph here that I have of a waterfall in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It's a really cool waterfall. You can obviously see core principles of composition in its makeup of a nice foreground, that's big, using a wide angle lens, and it kind of leads you to the waterfall. But why does it lead you to the waterfall? Well, let's look at it in terms of throwing shapes over top of this waterfall. So when I do that, you can see the amount of triangular patterns that are showing up within this scene, and we also have a really prominent curve to the overall composition that leads the viewer's eye naturally from one side of the frame to the other. When it does that, you're able to pair a lot of the triangles together. You're able to pair this curvature of the line together. And what happens when you do that is it creates a natural flow that somebody can look at and see and explore the entire image. A lot of times when you don't implement some of these things, what can happen is somebody can see the image and they say, well, that's a really pretty picture onto the next. I think when you're using these well and you use like curvature of lines that point to something and leaves more space after that point, what happens is their eye naturally gravitates to that circular or curved flow of visual principles, and they continue on into the composition, like they continue on in this image into a lot of negative space. And what happens is they're drawn back to these triangles in the foreground that really continue to point towards that main subject, which is the waterfall itself. Now, you can also use shapes in terms of repetition or mirrored shapes in the landscape. The one shot that distinctly comes to mind is from a trip to Grand Teton National Park, and you had this really spectacular mountain scene that was illuminated by golden hour. And what was really cool is with a telephoto lens, I could zoom up on this scene and photograph the snow that was blowing around on top of the mountain peak. And it just created this really nice scene with a lot of atmosphere to it, with cloud cover and golden hour and all that, and light just busting out from behind the mountains. But this is predominantly made up of mirrored triangles. We have a triangular shape of a piece of mountain that's been carved out of the face of the mountain, illuminated and accentuated by the light that was happening at the moment. But you also have a perfect triangular peak also accompanying that and creating that repetition and mirrored shape in the landscape. So again, when you do that, yes, they're able to see how much atmosphere and how much dynamic power was distributed and photographed in a distinct moment, but you're also able to simplify your composition by only having two shapes within it, but having paired shapes that mirror one another. And I think that's a really great way to do it too. It takes time to see these things. It takes multiple frames that you shoot, noticing first off the atmosphere, but then you're like, well, how do I now take what the landscape is showing me and take what the scene is showing me in the outdoors and frame that up in a way that creates shapes, that creates a noticeable repetition pairing of shapes. One thing that I love to do too is pairing multiple shapes together in one image. And I mean, this whole trip to Grand Teton National Park was absolutely amazing because not only is it a great landscape to go to, but we had great conditions all day long. And you're going to see photographs from that trip throughout this course. But you can pair multiple shapes together. So one morning, I was standing in the parking lot of Jenny Lake, and we had photographed the morning session, and we had just really beautiful light, alpenglow on the top of the mountain that's right behind Jenny Lake. And I took out PhotoPills, which is a photo planning app, and noticed that the path of the moon was going to sit the moon down right over top of one of the peaks on the mountains. So I opted to stand around in the parking lot for another hour and a half, 2 hours, and wait for the moon to get into place. Now, the moon had been full a couple days ago, so it was kind of waning off in its fullness, and it was still a really big, nice circular shape. So as that moon continued to go into position, it sat directly on top of the triangular shaped mountain that was there. So what you have here is a triangle almost used as like an arrow pointing directly to a sphere that is the moon. So you can pair multiple of these shapes together. You know, there are varying ways of doing this. Does it have to be triangles all the time? No, but that's prominently what a lot of landscape photographers come into contact with. Whether you're photographing mountain scenes, whether you're photographing sand dunes that are really popular to photograph, all these things have triangular shapes with it. So it's only natural that triangles would become the prominent player in these next level compositions that you start to see as shapes and as such. But also keep in mind curvature patterns within the landscape, you know, edges of lakes that you can use, Think about circular patterns with the sun paired with, jagged lines that can occur. Also, repetition of smaller scenes and having repetition of shapes and patterns that can occur within the petal of a desert plant, agave plants, or succulents. All of these things have repetition in them. What you have to think of as the photographer is, how do you use those core principles, leading lines, to help you distinguish what the line can lead to. Why is the leading line there? Because it can't just be forced into the scene and have nothing really to point to. And I think this happens a lot with the images. Let's look at multiple images that I've taken of pathways or trails that go through the scene. They don't really point to anything, and that's what happens when your leading line doesn't draw the viewer's eye to something and then have that pathway for them to come back and continue exploring the rest of the scene. So looking at it this way, we have to think about, why is the leading line there? Number one, and also, what is it pointing to? What do I want my viewer to see from that? So it's not like you have to put a leading line into every single image, and even if it's there, you don't have to put it in there, because it might not accompany the entire composition that you have in front of you. So really think about leading lines and shapes, because when you start using this more often, what happens is you stop seeing really a landscape, and you might say, oh, there's a mountain, there's a triangle there. What is that triangle doing? How can I pair it with other triangles? How can I use it as an arrow pointing to something, whether that be a moon sitting down over top of it, or even just a beautiful sky. So really think about what is occurring within the scene, and how can you use your core guiding principles of composition to accentuate shapes that you see in the landscape. So I hope you really enjoyed that chapter. I hope it was helpful to you, and I hope it was something that you haven't really heard too much about in compositions. I hope that you can use shapes now more effectively in your composition, shooting landscapes. And if you want to watch the rest of the course, just use the link below. I really hope that the course shines a new light on composition for you if you are tired of hearing the same old steps over and over. I think these are really going to pull you out of that rut or help you improve your photos that much more. Again, this course is free. You do have to use your email address to sign up for it and get it, but it's like an hour long, and it's probably going to give you a lot of helpful tips.